I thought there's no way I could be giving a presentation about the food supply chain if I hadn't been brave enough to eat this. And I do recommend it, yes, yes. Mind you, I also have a vision of, in my old age, with a screwdriver in the corner, trying to fix my robot to make sure it looks after me. So, food. It's something, food and drink is something I think we're all interested in. We all enjoy, to a lesser or a greater degree. My interest in food started with my father, who was a chef, and so I grew up in the world of hotels and restaurants. My uncle was a farmer. When I first knew of him, he was in Pakistan growing citrus, later on in Nigeria, and now going to become a leading economy, growing beef. And then in my own early days in the logistics industry, I spent a very happy summer loading 20-ton loads of outspan citrus in Cardiff docks, and then doing nighttime deliveries around the various mainland wholesale markets that we used to have in those countries. And let me tell you, that was the days before refrigeration, before vans, before taut liners, curtain-sided trucks. This was all primitive. This was flatbed, palletized, yes, but all sheets and ropes, so it really kept you fit. However, that's enough about my background. Where's my control? That's all right. It's okay. It's got back and next on it, so I should be able to cope. Now, Ellen has mentioned some of the key international challenges. I don't propose to go all the way through those, but you can see a number of them. First of all, this whole issue of rising population, shift in where that population's living, change of diet, the push for food security, which nations tend to be doing on their own individual basis. Rather than looking at the global situation, it's what they believe will look after themselves. We've mentioned urbanization. And then if you look in the second column there, the transport revolution. Now I mentioned loading citrus in Cardiff. Well, that was, all right, containers were being used, but nothing like to the extent that we've now got temperature controlled and environmentally controlled boxes today. So that was different. Information revolution, the way that's impacting on behaviors. You sit in a tube train in London and nobody is even having eye contact with anybody else. The phenomenon of big data, I'll come back to that maybe towards the end. Seriously, the way we're using land. Do we grow fuels? It's quite a question. Do we grow feeds? Do we grow food? And then look just at those last 2 points, the upstream food loss and downstream food waste. Go to places like India where we've got possibly 30 to 40% upstream food loss in the agricultural end of the supply chain. Those are serious issues. So what should we be trying to do, as it were, collectively, or what are the interests that people have? Well, as you can see, encouraging responsible sourcing. There's so much discussion now about sustainability, corporate responsibility. Is that just whitewash, or is it in fact something that organizations and countries are really concerned about? What about security of supply? If I'm a retailer, or if I'm in the world of catering, how confident am I that I'm going to be receiving my product, especially as it's coming from all over the world? Just the point on that, the UK government did its food security assessment in 2009. And one of the main sort of points of that was, well, we're okay because apart from the food that we produce locally, the rest is coming from our friends in either the Netherlands or in Germany. Without really taking on board, yeah, well, it's coming through those locations, but it's not actually being generated by them. True cost efficiency. We've talked about in supply chain theory, right, we can optimize this particular bit of the supply chain, but unless we take a holistic view, we end up reducing our costs here and costing somebody else down the track a lot more money. And then finally, product quality. Just as a personal comment, have you ever noticed, you've been buying fruit locally in the shops and whatever. I was looking at some pears in one of the leading supermarkets. You could have started a world war with them. They were that hard. So maybe there are things that we're doing which aren't in fact enhancing product quality, but in fact are causing problems with it. So how do we go about it? Well, it's very important to take the end-to-end view of the supply chain. You'll see there are sort of 4 sectors. We've got the agricultural world with obviously its production as far as the farm gate, manufacturing and processing of food, and there you'll see the diagram separates out sort of own label from branded products because the supply chains there work in a slightly different way. And then coming on to the consumer. And in countries like this country, the States, we see a tremendous shift where, because people are under pressure in terms of time, they're not, as we're preparing food at home, but they're going out to eat. And the same is true as emerging markets such as India and the way that's changing as well. So with all of those things, to really understand how we can look after the food supply chain, we have to take that end-to-end perspective. We have to, as it were, walk the process all the way through. And you notice there the diagram that illustrates the ports, little arrow, little blue arrow pointing up there. Now, the point about that is the port interface shifts as the year goes on. For example, for one part of the year, there's a lot of citrus coming out of Spain, and that is moved up, say, by truck into the UK. Other parts of the year, the citrus coming from the southern hemisphere, whether that be Brazil, Argentina, or South Africa. So obviously, where the port interface is and which ones you've got can vary throughout the year. And of course, as we're dealing with living things, well, maybe meat before it went through the abattoir was living, but also we think of living as in fresh produce as well. We're very much subject to what does the weather do? How fast do things grow? We plan production this way, but no, that's happened instead. So there are all sorts of issues there which come into it. So I thought just for a moment we could look at, shall we say, the bulk supply and an example of that, and then also look at the containerized unit load supply. So looking at bulk supply, going to one of my favorite parts of the world, Brazil, having worked in and out of Brazil since '98, amazing place. Different culture, hardworking people, very sophisticated. But the map on the left there shows the traditional growing areas up in the center. Well, actually the traditional growing areas are right down in the bottom left-hand corner there, in the 3 southern Brazilian states. Now they've moved up. They did the same sort of revolution in Brazil as they did in the Midwest of the United States almost a century before, where the whole area of Mato Grosso do Sul, that was being dug up and developed for soya. Quite conveniently, the state governor there was also the man who masterminded and controlled the leading soya producer. So that worked out very well. And everyone's focus was on the rainforest, while he quietly dug up the savanna. So there are issues there, but one of the things that we notice with the diagram there in the middle is how do you get the bulk product, whether that be crushed soya meal or whether it even be remaining as grain, how do you get it out to the ports? Bearing in mind that there are 3 major soya producers in the world. We've got Argentina, we've got Brazil, and we've got the United States. So this is a big player, and the rest of the world is dependent on them. So traditionally, particularly from the south, it's come out in those ports there of Paranaguá and also Rio Grande. We've then got the Santos movement, but you see the way, just in the middle there, from Cuiabá in the middle of Mato Grosso down to Santos, that's 1,700 kilometers. Now just think of that. And that's being moved, not necessarily by train, although you'll see there's an ALL train in one of the illustrations there, but by truck. See the top picture? Now, that is a colossal operation. And it's only by visualizing the whole thing, I mean, we could spend the rest of the day talking about it, but I promise you I won't. But it's only by visualizing the whole thing and understanding the supply chain from end to end, we can then start saying, right, where are the risks? Where are the environmental implications? What does this do to my costs? What does it do to my cycle times? Just looking very briefly at containerized food imports, been working with my colleague Peter Baker on this. not all products that could be containerized are yet containerized, but if we looked at the food products that could potentially be containerized as they're coming into the United Kingdom from the different source markets around the world, you're looking there at 4.7 million tons, or 4.8. Just look at the top 10. Mentioned South Africa earlier on, particularly to do with citrus. The volume of there, leading. Australia, wine. Think of the innovation there, the being used with a flexi tank going in a 20-foot dry container and then being brought over in bulk and then being bottled in the country of consumption, which is great until you think, well, actually, if that box coming up from Australia gets stuck as it's coming through, say, a terminal around Singapore, and it's on the top of the stack, and it's waiting there, and it's missed the last boat that went through, what does that do to the quality of my wine? Now, one of the research institutes in this country has been looking carefully at that very issue. Does it actually alter the structure of the wine? So there, just one point, the light blue shading, Asia Pacific, which includes, for the purposes of this analysis, Oceania. You can see that dominating. But then the other countries, or the other regions rather, more or less in even balance. So that is interesting because you look at all the different country, commodity category combinations, a lot of C's there. But once again, it's a question of understanding that and looking at that, analyzing it, and seeing that we've got both bulk traffic and unit load traffic in the food mix. Now remember earlier on we said we're looking at that linear. Remember the diagram that took us from the agricultural production through the manufacturing and processing and then on into the final market, which included both retail and also catering food service outlets. This is some work currently underway with 3 universities funded by one of the research councils, the 3 universities being Birmingham, Nottingham, and also Loughborough. We've been working on another project with Nottingham School of Economics, School of Biosciences the past year, and this is something that they've brought to the fore. In fact, it's ongoing research, and I'm sure if when you have the copy of the slides, I would suggest look at the links and develop this. Because the point that they make is that, yes, in blue, we've got illustrated, that's the actual physical distribution part of it. But there are lots of other dependencies and associated risks. For example, up at the top there, you've got all the infrastructure ones, then you've got others to do with the environment, society, and so on. So when we're unpicking the supply chain and trying to get to grips with it, it's important not just to take the linear view and say, okay, well, I've walked the process from here to here, so I must be all right. No, it's looking at everything alongside. Now, I've just hinted a little bit, for example, at some of the environmental issues there in Brazil. Well, what does that do to the supply chain? That has to be taken into account. What about the infrastructure dependency? Going back to our Brazil illustration again, fine, 1,700 kilometers and more, depending on where I'm growing, with inadequate trucking facilities, inadequate rail facilities, and the ports, huge congestion at the port. Now that's true not just of countries like Brazil, but also look at, say, what recent reports we've had on the West Coast ports of the United States. So it really helps us, and I think this will produce some interesting results as they go through over this 3-year program, to really look at the risks that are associated with it. So in conclusion, we came up with a long list of challenges and issues we're faced, and I've only just sort of touched on some of the highlights. What are the key challenges as far as I'm concerned? If I'm a logistician, a supply chain director, or what am I? What do I need to do? Well, one thing is I have to face the unexpected. Now, one of the magazines I read, and you probably think sad person, is the Fresh Produce Journal. And recently they produced the FPJ Big 50 People. Who were the real movers and shakers in the world of fresh produce supply chain around the world? Guess who was there? Vladimir Putin. His decision to ban imports of fresh produce from the European Union and various other countries back in July 2014 arguably stands as the biggest single issue affecting the global fresh produce sector today, and certainly in Europe. I never thought of him as a fruit and vegetable man. So really, think about the unexpected. We mentioned, Eleanor referred to cultures, and a very good definition that came from the Sloan School of Management at MIT. It's a while ago, but really, I do like it. The pattern of learned basic assumptions in an organization, or you could almost say, and in a community, that have worked well enough to be considered valid and are taught to new members of the organization. As a director said, working with him in Brazil, he said, really, I've come to the conclusion that although we've got all these other problems, the key issue to do with supply chain connectivity is in fact culture. And I tend to agree with him. The rise of cybercrime. The wake-up call was, I mean, for years we've heard, say, the United States with Strategic Air Command and things like that, involved in the military aspects of the world. But when the United States then came up with Cyber Command, that made me sit up. There's a very interesting article about it in The Economist. So cybersecurity is obviously a key point. And back to big data. I love Tim Harford's comments. He's in the Financial Times. He's the undercover economist. We get him in on radio interviews and so on. Very interesting man. And he's saying, well, first of all, with big data, do we really know what we mean when we say big data? So that's one question. And then he made this observation. Beware, we are just making the same old statistical errors, but on a grander scale than ever. So it's a question of having that balance and keeping our eyes open and seeing what we think as we go through. But really, those are the 4 challenges out of them all I was thinking would, that's my personal opinion, could really apply to us all. The unexpected, or the expected, or the unexpected, I should say, the cultural issues, cybercrime, and then how we're coping with big data. So what will you do? Well, my recommendation is appreciate the scale and the complexity. Look at the big picture of whatever supply chain that we're looking at. Make a rigorous assessment of the risks. Let's take just the linear approach, but also look at all the implications on either side of it. Welcome the challenges. Otherwise, you'd go into tears, wouldn't you? So welcoming the challenges, having a positive approach to those key challenges. So all I can say is thank you.